Our text today is from John chapter 5, verses 1 through 18. Hear the word of the Lord. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now, there is in Jerusalem near the Sheep Gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here, a great number of disabled people used to lie: the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him laying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the man replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I am trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." And Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." And once the man was cured, he picked up his mat and walked. The day on which this took place was a Sabbath, and so the Jewish leaders said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. The Lord forbids you to carry your mat." But he replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" So they asked him, "Who is this fellow that told you to pick up and walk?" The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you're well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who had made him well. So, because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders began to persecute him. In his defense, Jesus said to them, "My Father is always at work to this very day, and I am too working." For this reason, they tried all the more to kill him, not only because he was breaking the Sabbath, but because he was calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
In our in-person services, we offer a conversation prompt during the greeting time, and I want to share that with you as well. If you could have one thing about yourself changed in an instant, what would it be? Why that one thing? Hold on to that question. We'll come back to it later. But the question embedded in our scripture today is, do you want to get well? What a question! It was interesting for me to be contemplating this question while recovering from a wicked stomach bug this week. There was nothing I wanted more than to get well. Hi, I'm John. I'm one of the Highrock pastors, and my gift to you today is that I will spare you all the gory details of my recent illness. But what I will not spare you is this insistent question from Jesus: do you want to get well? How strange a question, especially when asked of a man who had a crippling disability for 38 years. By the time we meet him, his only plan is to wait by the Bethesda pool for the waters to stir. Legend had it that as the waters began to stir, only the first person in would be healed. Think about that. It's a pool where the paralyzed and disabled wait for healing, but only the first one in. A race where second place is literally first loser. It's a cruel joke. But this cruel joke appears to be this man's whole life. It's his only hope, until Jesus comes to him during a holy festival on a Sabbath day and asks, "Do you want to get well?" What a strange question. I mean, who would put themselves through such repeated indignity and cruelty if they didn't want to be healed? Still, it's an interesting question, and perhaps not a strange question if we consider our own lives. A few moments earlier, we had a chance to consider a slightly different question. If you could have one thing about yourself changed in an instant, what would it be? And why that one thing? Some of us might wish for some superficial change. I'd like to be taller, fitter, more financially secure. Or maybe we'd have grander desires, superhuman even, the ability to fly, or maybe read minds, or how about super healing so I wouldn't ever get another stomach bug? But many of us answered that question with things that are more realistic, or at least partially under our own control. For many of us, to ask what we would want changed is the same as asking, do you want to get well? And if you answered the question that way, then I'm willing to guess that the problem you're wrestling with has been with you a long time, maybe as long as this man who was rendered helpless for almost 38 years. When I was just 5 years old, my pediatrician diagnosed me as hyperactive. That's what they used to call it before terms like ADHD. He recommended Ritalin, but my parents were reluctant to use medications. I truly appreciate their concern for my well-being, but that concern meant that I went diagnosed but untreated for my entire childhood. I can remember every parent-teacher conference simply because they were all the same. Mr. and Mrs. Mury, your child is very bright, but seems unable to control his behavior and focus on his work. He's having trouble concentrating. He's daydreaming, fidgeting, not paying attention, inappropriate and disruptive behavior in the classroom, etc. And every year, my parents would come down on me for not working harder. Every report card brought disappointment and consequences. But nothing ever changed despite all my well-meaning promises to do better. Eventually, no one had to say a word to me. I had heard those disappointed voices so frequently that they became like my own thoughts, and I listened to them over and over, probably while I was supposed to be paying attention. It was brutal. Eventually, I graduated high school with a C average. I knew I wasn't living up to my potential. No one had to tell me, though so many adults kindly took the time to remind me of that fact. Did I want to get well? Yes, absolutely. Or did I? Forgive me for going on such a long time on my own personal challenges, but I want for us to all understand how Jesus' question is not so simple. Do you want to get well? Can be anything but simple. Consider the man's response to Jesus. Jesus asks him, do you want to get well? You would think that after 38 years, the answer would be a simple, yes, please. After all, 38 years could be an entire lifetime back then. But listen to how he answers this supposedly simple question. Sir, I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me. That's terrible. But I'm still not hearing a yes. His answer sounds more like a list of excuses. Jesus just asked him if he wants to get well. Where's the, yes, I want to get well? But why wouldn't someone want to get well? Why the deflection rather than a simple yes? I don't know, and we're not told. I believe that the Bible often leaves us with these obvious and unanswered questions because God is inviting us to wrestle through these questions ourselves. In other words, I think Jesus is asking us as well, do you want to get well? And before you answer, are you sure? Sometimes the answer is not so simple. Sometimes there is a hidden payoff in our problems. As much as we'd like to get well, we shudder at the thought of losing that benefit. Many people wrestling with addiction report that the pain that they're trying to numb seems greater than the pain of the addiction itself. One of my neighbors, a beautiful woman with a lovely family, ended up losing her marriage, losing her young children, and recently losing her life to alcohol. Do you want to get well? Is often not a simple question, and looking in from the outside, many of us will never realize the demons that people must face before healing becomes possible. For many of us, the things we've wanted to change about ourselves seem like small nuisances compared to a crippling disability or a life-endangering addiction like those. Maybe you just want to be a truthful person, but you continually slip into telling white lies to make yourself look better or to make others feel better. Do you really want to get well if that means losing the safe haven of a little fib here and there? Or maybe you love to spill the tea on others who seem like they're doing so well. You know what God says about speaking only what is useful for building others up, but it's just so hard to resist. And honestly, it feels so good to be at the center of attention for a few moments. Or maybe there's dishonesty in your relationships. The you that people see, or the you that you want them to see, is an image. It's not the real you. You want to be real, but you're not sure if people would stick with you if they knew the real you. so you settle for being loved or respected for the person you pretend to be, rather than risk not being loved or respected at all. How about anger? A part of you wants to be able to control your anger, but that anger is also power. Sometimes anger gets things done, and it can also protect you from feelings of disrespect and insignificance. It's not easy to give up. I've met people who are paralyzed with guilt, shame, or fear. It makes them afraid to accept love. Always helping, never accepting help, or even admitting the need. I can hide behind helping. If I'm a helper, I can get close to people without getting so close that I risk getting hurt deeply. In these examples and so many others, to be healed sounds wonderful on the surface. But deeper down, there's something that we gain from our disease. There is a payoff in our pathology. Do we want to get well? Yes. Sure. Maybe? Let me think about it. For the disabled man at the Bethesda pool, we're not sure why he deflects and hesitates to answer Jesus. Maybe his disability had become his identity. Maybe if he was healed after 38 years, he would have no way of providing for himself and with no job skills, no trade. Imagine having to start fresh with no skills in middle age or older. At least as a disabled man, he had charity and the pity of others, as he likely had to beg. Or maybe he had gotten so used to seeing himself as the victim. There's no one to help me. Someone else always gets there first. I can't walk. Don't you see me here? There can be a hidden benefit to being a perpetual victim. For all the downsides, it doesn't require any action or responsibility from me. Pity might be a poor substitute for love and friendship, but it's at least something, right? I have never wrestled with something as debilitating and long-lasting as this man's disability, so I do not know what it's like. But I would think that after 38 years, eventually, I might come up with a plan. Maybe for one short window of time, have a team of friends stay with me so I can be sure to be the first in the pool. Or maybe for a couple of weeks straight, have my friends drop me off first thing in the morning as close as I can get to the pool. Maybe put hard wooden runners under my mat so that my mat slips on the hard stone and I can drag myself quickly to the water. I don't know. But he had 38 years to come up with a solution, didn't he? Instead, the man's answer to Jesus sounds like an excuse that says, "It's impossible. I can't be healed. I'm a victim here, Jesus." Despite all the deflection and excuse making, Jesus apparently is able to discern that deep down, the man wants to be healed. As Pastor Megan preached about 2 weeks ago, Jesus knows what's really inside of us, even things we can't acknowledge about ourselves. Jesus apparently can see that despite any mixed feelings or hesitancy, the man actually does want to be healed by Jesus. The text doesn't say it plainly, but the man's response does. Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." At once, the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. No hesitation. He gets up, picks up his mat, and walks. Right now, we're in a series called Witness, the First-Hand Faith of John. And that word witness can be understood in two ways. First, we can witness the power of the risen Jesus. We can spiritually experience the kinds of healings to which John, the gospel writer, testifies. We can have our own first-hand faith, like in this encounter, to hear Jesus ask us the question, "Do you want to get well?" And once we have a first-hand experience of faith, we can witness to others about what we have seen. We can invite them to also have a first-hand experience of the power of God in Jesus Christ. In John's gospel, this is the third of 7 miracles that John highlights for special attention. Each of these 7 is selected because it invites us to consider something important about who Jesus is and the work that he came to do. And the man who is healed is not the only witness to this sign. There are the religious leaders, and they have some questions of their own. The religious leaders apparently didn't see the healing take place themselves. Instead, what they see is a miraculously healed man who is walking and carrying the mat he was previously lying upon. So they confront him. The Jewish leaders said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." For context, the Sabbath day of rest was a very important day. It made God's top 10 list, along with don't murder and don't steal. So this accusation of breaking the Sabbath is no small matter. It's also a huge part of Israel's history that their refusal to honor the Sabbath in the past had led to suffering on a national scale. So when the Jewish leaders saw this man carrying his mat, they took notice. In the 10 Commandments, it says, "The seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work." And in their interpretation of God's rules, carrying your mat is work. Walking a short distance is not work. They're not heartless monsters. But carrying your mat is definitely work, at least in their system of man-made rules, and that means trouble. So the religious leaders accused the man of breaking the Sabbath, but he replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.' Hey, I'm just doing what the man told me." "What man? Show him to us." But Jesus had slipped into the crowd, and the healed man somehow had never gotten Jesus' name. Now, Jesus will not avoid such attention in the future, but at this point, he's only on the third sign with 4 more to go. He's not ready to lay down his life just yet. In a more private moment, Jesus returns to the healed man, but this time with a warning. "See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." We have to be careful here. Sometimes when we suffer, we're responsible for our own suffering, but quite often in life, we suffer through no fault of our own. In the 6th of the 7 signs that Jesus will perform, also on a Sabbath, Jesus will heal a man whom people just assume must have sinned because he is suffering. We should be careful not to make the same mistake, which only makes people's suffering worse. But in this case, Jesus seems to perhaps imply some connection between the man's physical condition and his moral condition. And who knows, maybe that's why he was hesitant about getting well. Maybe he thought he deserved his terrible condition. But out of mercy, Jesus both heals him and warns him so he can avoid more suffering in the future. Jesus wants him to be free, and Jesus wants you to be free as well. And that includes being free of unnecessary rules of religiosity and propriety, like all the additional Sabbath-keeping rules that were like a prison for people. Sabbath was meant to create freedom from work so people could rest and worship God and love one another without the ever-encroaching tyranny of work. They had been slaves in Egypt, and Sabbath was meant to keep them free from becoming slaves again. But the leaders went from ignoring Sabbath completely to becoming such sticklers about Sabbath that you could spit on a rock because that's not work. But spitting in the dirt was work because spitting in dirt makes mud, and mud makes bricks, and bricks, that's work. To paraphrase Jesus, the Sabbath was made for the benefit and freedom of people, not to enslave people all over again. And that may be why Jesus performs this miracle on the Sabbath and ordered this man to pick up his mat on the Sabbath. He had been disabled for 38 years. Surely Jesus could have waited one more day. One more day wouldn't have mattered, would it? Unless Jesus really wanted to make a point about both his own divine authority and our tremendous importance to him. And in that case, how perfect that Jesus chose a day that celebrates freedom to grant this man the freedom he had longed for these 38 years. But the religious leaders, rather than being amazed at this healing, instead all they can see is a rule-breaking enemy, one who lays claim to divine authority, and one that they begin to make plans to kill. In our remaining time, I want to consider another reason that I think John includes this miracle as the third sign. At the end of this gospel, John says that Jesus performed many other signs, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. In other words, this third sign was chosen very intentionally. There's something that we're supposed to see in it that helps us to have that firsthand kind of faith. A faith where we personally experience and witness Jesus' person and power, and then share that witness with others. So why does John include this particular miracle as the third sign? Once again, this is a question we are invited to wrestle with ourselves. I think one reason is that this story is a perfect illustration of all of us. This man was helpless to save himself, just like us. He wanted to be healed, just like us. But he surrendered to the belief that nothing changes, that he would be stuck as he is. And like him, we all want to be healed. We all want to be changed, but we try and fail. We still remain persistently selfish, still reluctant to love, to sacrifice, still hesitant to trust God, still stingy with forgiveness, or still unable to shake a nagging sense that we are not known, not loved, not valued, and maybe not even worth any of that. But God sends Jesus into the world, not to condemn the world, but so the world might have life through him. God so loved the world, the cosmos, that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him might not perish, but have eternal life. The Father is bringing new life, and so Jesus is all about bringing healing and new life. The Father is at work, and Jesus is therefore at work as well. I shared earlier about my struggles with ADHD, or hyperactivity as my pediatrician called it. And like the disabled man who was healed by Jesus, I eventually discovered that I too was hesitant to be made well. I like to tell people that I squeezed 4 years of college into 10. That's how long it took me to finally complete my bachelor's degree. Do you want to get well? I would have screamed, yes. But during extended premarital counseling, still struggling to complete my bachelor's degree, I finally saw why none of my efforts had produced anything but temporary relief. I was a firstborn child with all the duties and responsibilities that implies, plus more. When my parents separated when I was 9 years old, I was told that I was the man of the house and I would have to help raise my younger brothers. In so many ways, I was a dutiful child, but I was also fiercely independent and refused to be controlled. In other words, a hot mess. And if there were 3 duties that were drilled into my head, they were study hard, practice piano, and keep my room clean. And I failed miserably at all 3. And with the help of this therapist, I suddenly saw why. I had seen all my efforts as a failure. But what if it wasn't a failure? What if I was actually protecting myself? I had come to feel so compelled, so tightly controlled, that the only way to fight back was to refuse to comply in these 3 ways. The thought of doing any of them had always felt like a crushing weight on my spirit, and suddenly I could see why. Those 3 areas were like a personal last stand. If I refused to give in, I could hold on to a sense that I have not given up and that no one else controlled me. But fighting that fight wasn't protecting me anymore. Instead, I was hurting myself. By trying not to be controlled in that way, I was more constrained by others than if I had done nothing at all. My attempts to save myself were only making it worse. Since that childhood experience, I had met Jesus and had my own firsthand faith. and I no longer felt morally compelled to comply with any other human being's vision for my life. And instead, I had gained a real sense of calling. I'd even participated in a workshop that helped crystallize what I believe was my God-given vision to be a teacher and leader in the body of Christ. And so Tom, our counselor, asked me a simple series of questions. First, he asked me to forget what my parents or anyone else wanted for a moment. He said, "John, do you believe that God wants you to dedicate your life to being a teacher and leader in the church?" "Yes." "Do you need your college degree to do that?" And I answered, "Technically, no, but it would be super helpful." "Then do it because you want to do it, not because anyone else is compelling you to do it." It was as if Jesus, through Tom, had asked me if I wanted to get well, and I said yes. And that was it. It sounds crazy, but after all those years of struggling and suffering, it was like a key that opened a final lock barring the way to freedom. A semester later, I was done with college, and almost immediately I was on to graduate school, where I received consistent A's for grades for the first time in my life. It was like Jesus had told me to pick up my mat and walk, and I did. Just like the disabled man, after all the deflection and hesitation, when the time came, the transformation felt almost instantaneous. Not because I tried any harder, not because I suddenly became any smarter, not because I was somehow a better person, but simply because Jesus had set me free and opened my eyes to the life he had for me at a moment when I was finally ready to see it. Of course, my story is not your story. But I believe that all of us are invited to see our story in today's story, in this third of 7 signs. I believe that we are all invited to hear Jesus' question, "Do you want to get well?" I believe we're meant to wrestle with that question until finally we hear Jesus tell us to get up and walk, whatever that may mean for you. Like we talked about earlier, maybe you're struggling with an addiction or a slippery relationship with the truth, or dishonesty in your relationships, hiding behind an image rather than being real, putting up a shield of anger, or even the temptation to hide behind the desire to constantly help others without ever allowing others to help you. Do you want to get well? Maybe you can even hear Jesus telling you now to get up and walk. I don't hear Jesus' words as a command as much as an invitation. Jesus is not imposing yet another compulsion upon us. Instead, he is calling us to the freedom and purpose for which we were all created. Do you want to get well? Wrestle with that question. It took me decades on this issue. It took the man in this story 38 years. I hope it will go much more quickly for you, but please don't give up and ask for help. I hate to think how much longer I might have been trapped without that counselor. Just be ready to do whatever Jesus says when he tells you it's time for you to get up and walk.